I can't tell you how thrilled we are to offer you this opportunity to hear directly from Lutheran pastor and the Dean of Bethlehem's Bible College, the Revd Dr Munther Isaac. He's going to talk to us about the impact of the occupation on the indigenous church and on the life of Palestinians day to day. So I think without further ado, I'm delighted to invite the Revd Dr Munther Isaac to speak.
Good evening, everyone. It's almost 9 p.m. here in Bethlehem, Palestine, and I'm so glad to meet all of you, even if through the blessing of technology. And thank you for showing up to this important webinar. And I hope that together we have a good time and that we think together how the church can respond to this very important topic. And thank you, Philip and all, for giving me the opportunity to address you. And today I will be sharing about a theme that I call The Other Side of the Wall, which is the title of a book I just published, which explains the plight of Palestinian Christians and of Palestinians as a community that's been marginalized on the other side of the wall, in the real sense, as in there is a wall in Palestine and we are locked behind it, but also in a very real spiritual and metaphorical way as well. I speak, of course, as a Palestinian Christian who lives and was born in Bethlehem. Many times people are surprised to know that there are Palestinian Christians. We exist. It would be a surprise if we did not exist, because this is where Christianity have started. I am part of the Protestant tradition, but of course the majority of Palestinian Christians belong to the Oriental or the Greek Orthodox Church. We have also Catholics, and about 5 to 7% of Palestinian Christians are Protestants, as in Anglican, Lutheran, and free evangelical churches. Yet our overall percentage in the land is very little. We're almost now around 1% of the total population, who, of course, we live among a majority of Jews on one side and the Israeli side, and on our side of the wall, a majority of Muslims. But the church has been always there. The church, not just as in buildings and structure, but as in people, as in living stones. My family has been living in the Bethlehem area for at least 400 to 500 years. That's what we are able to trace our family line back to. The Arab church itself is an old phenomenon, and I hope, as I said, when people are surprised to know that there are Arab Christians, I remind folks that when the creeds were written many years ago, there were Arab bishops already in the ecumenical council. This is our church, and today, as I said, I will be sharing about a Palestinian Christian perspective from the other side of the wall. And as I will hope to show, the wall has different meanings, at least in my understanding. This is an attempt to explain reality on the ground through the complexity of maps. The situation in our land is very complex. Of course, the land is divided between what is known as Israel proper, which was established in 1948, and the West Bank and Gaza, which you see, of course, and which was later occupied by Israel since 1967. And as someone who lives in Bethlehem, 5 minutes from 10 minutes maybe drive from Jerusalem, along with East Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the rest of the West Bank has been under Israeli military control since 1967. And during those days, Israel expanded its control of the West Bank by building the settlements, which you see in the blue dots. I hope you can see the map is not too small, inside the West Bank. During the early 2000, they built the separation wall, which you see in the red, surrounding Palestinian towns. Bethlehem, for example, is surrounded from the wall in one side and settlements on the other hand. Our situation in a nutshell in the West Bank, at least where I come from, is that we are isolated within our cities. Israel controls everything around the cities, from the roads to the land to the settlements. The vast majority of the West Bank, which is classified under the old peace deals as Area C, is fully under Israeli control, meaning that Palestinians who live there cannot even build. So a place like Bethlehem cannot expand naturally. A place like Hebron, of course, is surrounded by Israeli settlements and Area C. So we are suffocated within our cities. And the proposed peace plan, which was proposed by the American administration, of course, in full coordination with the Israelis, seems to embody that reality of gated Palestinian communities in the West Bank. You see us in the green, controlled by Israel. The roads between the cities are controlled by Israel. So meaning Bethlehem becomes a city with two gates, one to the north, one to the south, and Israel controls these days. Today, that's our reality. Today, all that Israeli military has to do is to close maybe 2 or 3 checkpoints, and the whole region of Bethlehem will become a big prison. And this is something that happens regularly. So I'm not speaking hypothetically. This is what I mean by the idea of roads connecting our cities. And the annexation, which Israel was planning to do in the beginning of July, will mean that Israel will turn the majority of the land in the 1967 portion into part of the state of Israel, meaning that now Palestinians cannot build there, cannot expand, and our land will be further and further confiscated. The wall that I shared here really divides the land in different ways. And I hope that you don't see the wall as just a line on a map, because there are realities on the ground shaped by the wall. Not just the checkpoints and the daily humiliation, but realities of, for example, water distribution on both sides of the wall is incredibly different. I think latest statistics show that on average, an Israeli person uses 5 to 6 times more water than a Palestinian. And that number either increases further in the Israeli settlements. So that's what I mean by a wall that divides into 2 realities. Another very telling reality on the ground, on both sides of the wall, is the gross domestic products per capita. On the Israeli side, it's $38,000 according to the World Bank list. On the Palestinian side, it's less than $3,000. Unemployment rate, you see the differences. And of course, now COVID-19 situation means that the number is much more than 29%. There is even 2 laws on the ground. Palestinians have to go through the military law. That's why Israel can confiscate our land under the pretext of security. And the Israeli settlers have to go through a different law that favors or that privileges them. So land confiscation is a real issue. And residency rights, because of course under the Israeli immigration laws, any Jewish person around the world can immigrate to our land. It will become their homeland. They will have more rights than the Palestinians who live and who have been living in this land for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So the wall creates 2 realities on the ground, 2 realities of discrimination. And this is really important for our discussion when I explain about Palestinian Christian theology or Palestinian Christian responses to this phenomena. And I strongly recommend that you get more exposure to Palestinian Christian theology, because a lot of it is us trying to respond to this reality we find, whether it's the historical experience of the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe, or today's inequality that exists on the ground. I will be sharing these titles with you. But really, this is our reality, speaking not just out of hurt and pain, but speaking from the other side of the wall, where we have less rights, where we have a much more miserable human conditions. We don't have freedom or independence, where we are subjected to a brutal military occupation. I want to refer you to the Palestinian historical experience of Nakba. Nakba is an Arabic word for catastrophe. What the world celebrated in 1948 as the creation of the State of Israel was indeed our catastrophe, as you see illustrated in terms of the villages destroyed, in terms of the refugees, that crisis that was created. When this happened, it was celebrated by the world as a sign of divine intervention, as a miracle of God. When you consider how Christians have been talking about the creation of Israel, or about the relationship between the church and Israel, or the church and the Jewish people over the years, these terms are commonly used to talk about the Abrahamic covenant that continues with the Jewish people today and by association with the State of Israel, or the fact that the creation of Israel is a fulfillment of prophecy or a sign to God's faithfulness to the Jewish people. And let me just briefly comment on those two statements, which come from different, whether church documents or statements, mainly Western churches. What is it telling me as a Palestinian to know that the other side of the equation in my reality is in covenant with God? What does this tell me as a Palestinian? Is God against me? The whole idea of a fulfillment of prophecy prompts the question that many Christians here would ask: why would God do this to us in order to fulfill a prophecy? And if the creation of Israel is a sign of God's faithfulness to the Jewish people, then is it a sign of God's condemnation to the Palestinian people? And if God indeed gave the land as an eternal possession to the Jewish people, does that mean that it is not our homeland? But we've been living here for hundreds, if not more. Does that mean that we should accept to live as second-class citizens in our homeland? And in the same way, the wall today shields us Palestinians from the millions of pilgrims who come on a yearly basis in the pre-COVID-19 world, of course, to the Holy Land, where they experience the Holy Land in its beauty but never meet Palestinians. I think this is what's happening here, and what has already been happening in theology books and in documents, where the Palestinians don't simply exist. And today, this is translated to a system of political support to Israel, referred to often as Christian Zionism. The support of Christians, not just to the Zionist ideology, but more so to the current state of Israel, financial, political lobbying, funding the settlements, and so on. So here we're talking about churches giving up to billions, not millions, billions of dollars on over the years, not to churches here, but to settlement projects, even to the Israeli military. All of this is well documented in research and in data. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm talking about things that everyone knows about. And in the midst of this system of support to Israel, whether it's theological or political, we as Palestinian Christians simply sometimes want to raise our hand and say, hello, what about us? And sorry to bring it back to the British colonial era. Think of phrases like a land without people, for a people without a land. A statement, of course, that promotes the myth that the land was empty. But of course, the land was not empty. As someone has put it, in terms of it was empty for them, because the Palestinian Arabs were a complete irrelevant. Palestine was empty, not literally, but in terms of people of equal worth to the incoming settlers. And I think that's colonial, and dare I say colonial Christian mentality. A mentality that's reflected today in many circles, especially evangelical circles, consider a title like, "Do Jews Have a Divine Right to Israel's Land?" from Christianity Today, which is the #1 Christian websites in North America. Again, it's a classic example of two theologians, an American and a Messianic Jew in this case, sitting at the comfort of their offices, discussing our land as if it's empty. And in fact, I tried to email, and I actually emailed the website saying, "Can I respond? I am a theologian from Bethlehem. I live in this land. At the time, I was doing my PhD on this topic at the Oxford Center for Mission Studies, so I felt very qualified to address this topic. But they didn't give me the opportunity, because to them, at best, I will present a Palestinian perspective, but the right interpretation comes from the Western Academy, not from us. We are invisible in the same way today to the millions of pilgrims. Sometimes even by choice, people don't want to associate with us. And these walls do more than just dismiss people or put us on the other side as if to ignore our reality, because these walls usually stereotype people to the sense of dehumanizing. Then violence is justified against them because, and of course, they brought it to themselves. They're not like us. Let me quote the American Vice President, Mike Pence, and he told the Israeli Knesset or parliament, "We stand with Israel because your cause is our cause. Your values are our values, and your fight is our fight. We stand with Israel because we believe in right over wrong, in good over evil, and in liberty over tyranny." And look at in this very short quote how Palestinians are portrayed. We are the wrong, the evil, and the tyrant, as opposed to the good side, the American-Israeli alliance, which in Mike Pence's ideology represents the axis of good, the Judeo-Christian tradition. They are the same values, the values of freedom, the values of liberty, of rightness, and of good. And see, Palestinians here become the evil side, the tyrant side. This is what walls do. I many times say, imagine that there is a wall that exists between Christians in the West and Palestinian Christians. And we are on the other side, and on your side, you find all these slogans that people have written about us to describe us as Palestinian Christians. All of these slogans that I'm sharing now on the screen, all of these labels are actual labels that people used in the West to describe a movement called Christ at the Checkpoint by Palestinian Christians, to kind of label us as the wrong side and to discourage people from engaging with us. All of these are attacks by Christians on Palestinian Christians, attempts to silence Palestinian Christians. You say, we are on the other side, don't talk to them. Don't step into the side of the Palestinians. And if Palestinian Christians want to speak on behalf of Palestinian Christians, don't believe them. They're not saying the truth. This idea of silencing Palestinian Christians is something that I have experienced firsthand, and many of my colleague theologians and pastors, in the form of being invited to speak in conferences only to have the invitation withdrawn. We've had Christian conferences in seminaries on Palestine and Israel without any Palestinian speakers, and the only speaker that was invited, a Palestinian Christian, was disinvited. Once they wanted to disinvite me from speaking in a conference on the basis of because you're a Palestinian. So that's what was used to disqualify me, even in a mission conference. The whole idea of silencing us, I think, is because we pose a very serious challenge to Christians who prefer to stay on their side, not step into our side, and stereotype, label all Palestinians as evil, as Muslims. But because we can speak on behalf of the Palestinians as Christians, we break this stereotype. We cause a dilemma, because now churches sometimes feel they have to listen to the Christian voices, and we challenge this perception that they have on Palestinians and Muslims. Our message brings a strong challenge to that ideology of walls, to that ideology of dehumanization. We highlight issues related to justice, related to the injustices of the occupation. We want to elevate human rights. We're not simply complaining about our situation, we're challenging the interpretation of the Bible as it relates not just to ethical issues, but as it relates to exegetics and exegesis and to understandings of issues like promised land and the people of God, the seed of Abraham, who are Abraham's children, and so on. Now, in my final part, let me bring some practical issues on the ground. Our voices as Palestinian Christians, first of all, it's not a voice to say that we want, for example, to destroy Israel or to get rid of the Jewish people. All that we are saying is that as Palestinian Christians, we believe that Christians around the world should deal with Israel based on the international law, not based on the language of divine right or fulfillment of prophecy, as if there is a divine component to the creation of Israel. Because we've seen that Christians who use that language want to keep us silent over injustice, and they have been silenced over the injustices. In other words, we want to challenge people using the Bible to justify what Israel is doing. As we see here, the Israeli ambassador in the UN holding a Bible to justify Israel's right to break international law and build further more and more settlements. To that, Palestinian Christians have said in the famous Kairos Palestine document, we declare that any use of the Bible to legitimize or support political options and positions that are based upon injustice imposed by one person on another or by one people on another, transform religion into human ideology and strip the word of God of its holiness, its universality, and its truth. As Christians, Jesus commanded us, blessed are the peacemakers. And this is our message. It's time we take this seriously. Remembering that Jesus said this statement in a politically charged environment, peacemaking is a very risky business because it means you have to step to the other side. You can't stay on one side. You have to listen to both sides, but also you have to take a stand. You have to take a stand with truth and justice. But if you see the occupation and simply say we have to pray for both sides, you are empowering the occupation. So peacemaking involves, yes, stepping on the other side, listening, praying for both, but also speaking truth to power. And I've always said that if our theology trumps, and I've used this word before, it got another meaning. If our theology trumps the biblical ethical teachings of Jesus, of love, equality, and justice, then we must rethink our theology. And the church cannot be silent when it sees injustice. There have been churches also who simply respond with charity, but who say, we don't want to be involved in politics. And again, I say, you're empowering the structure of injustice. We want to emphasize that every land belongs to God, especially our land. It doesn't belong to any nation or religion. Sharing it is different than dividing it. Sharing means we look at each other as equal. The Kairos Palestine puts it this way. This is our hope that through our love, we will overcome the injustices and establish foundations for a new society, both for us and our opponents. See, our goal is not to eliminate our opponents, but to think of our future and their future as one. This is my challenge that I bring to you today, to reconsider, as I said, these issues of theology, prayer, and action. But as churches, we have the responsibility to promote a shared land through our theology, through our prayer, and through our action. Thank you, and I will be more than happy to entertain some more discussion with you.
Thank you, Munther, for challenging us and sharing so powerfully your insight and your experience as a Christian in Bethlehem today.